Hello YouTube. Today I'll tell you about a very interesting island in the area of the Russian Arctic. For reasons we may not understand completely, the island is off limits to foreigners and has some eerie, as I can describe it, paranormal phenomena. Its proximity to the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, the forbidden territory of nuclear testing, does not explain this secrecy in its entirety. I'll tell you what I know. It's all open stuff, open source materials, but still fascinating. For more strange phenomena of the Russian Arctic, please see the playlist that is listed in the description to this video, and you will find out about UFOs, USOs, and other developments there. Now, the Soviet Union owned vast territories with different climatic conditions. The island of Vaygach became better known after the Soviet government dispatched expedition, the purpose of which was the development and extraction of minerals. But the history of this place goes deep into antiquity. Various tribes have lived there for a long time. It is known that until the 10th century, the island was considered to be the sacred land of the Nenets people. They did not live on these lands so as not to desecrate these places with their presence. There were divine idols on the island which the Nenets worshipped and regularly made sacrifices to. These territories were called the Land of Death. There are some hypotheses about the name of the island of Vaygach. Dutch and English navigators believe that it comes from the word Vaygach, strong winds, or Vaygach, the gate of the winds, and the German from Wehen, gap in the watershed between the Barents and the Kara Sea. Vaygach is located 350 kilometers from the Arctic Circle. This Arctic island stands on the section of the Kara and Barents Seas. Its length stretches for 100 kilometers, and its width is about 43 kilometers. There are not only harsh but unique climatic conditions, unusual flora and fauna. Soviet geologists became seriously interested in this territory in 1921 when they found deposits of polymetallic ores on the island. The saturation of ores with zinc and lead was very high. It was a necessary material for the development of the industry in the Soviet Union. To extract the ores, it was necessary to do very laborious work. Since it was hard work, they decided to use the Gulag prisoners for the so-called dirty work. Let me clarify. Starting in 1929, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin sought to create a centralized and strong state. It was quite possible if you subdue the consciousness of the Soviet people. And the communists knew how to do it, but the people did not succumb to this easily. There were always those who had their own opinion, and there was never-ending resistance to the bloody socialist regime imposed on the lands of the former Soviet Empire. Stalin and his entourage used their own unique method of suppressing the people. They used fear. Suddenly, it turned out that there are huge numbers of spies and saboteurs in the USSR who should be punished and imprisoned or sent to exile. And of course, their families suffered as well. By 1930, entire networks of hard labor camps had been deployed throughout the Soviet Union to accommodate a huge number of enemies of the people. This is how the Gulag, or the main directorate of camps and detention areas, had appeared. It is known that from 1930 to 1953, there were at least more than 20 million prisoners in the Gulag camps. Most of them did not commit any crime. They simply did not fit into the state system established by the Stalinist regime. In 1930, the village of Varnek was built in the southern part of the island. However, it was not the convicts working at the mines who lived there. but the guards and the administration of the Gulag. The Latvian communist Further Eichmanns led the Vaygach expedition. Although ethnicity means nothing, they were regime henchmen and bootlickers from all ethnic backgrounds. Prior to this appointment, he was the commandant of the Solovetsky camp, and I mentioned this in my other videos because Solovetsky Islands, that's the place of those strange ancient mazes called Babylons. Anyway, he was also an employee of the NKVD, or that's how the KGB was known at the time. Eichmanns supervised the construction of not only houses for management and security, but also barracks for prisoners and a processing plant. The search and development of the mines was left by Professor Pavel Wittenberg. He was also a prisoner, but accepted the offer of the management to do scientific work. He and his team managed to find more than 500 ore points with boron, lead, fluorine, and zinc within 2 years. However, there were fantastic rumors about the camps with prisoners on the island. It was rumored that there were about 100,000 people living in deplorable conditions and working very hard. All of them mined not ores, but silver and gold. Later, there were rumors that there were about 20,000 prisoners. There were no more than 1,000 of them, as is claimed in reality, but over time it became 2 times more. We just don't know. The weather conditions were very severe. Due to severe frosts, not everyone managed to survive the winter. Gold and silver were not mined on the island. A great preference was given to lead mining, and this had a significant impact on people's health. Imagine the hellish cold conditions of the Arctic winter and mining lead. Vaygach was compared to death. No wonder the ancient Nenets people called this island the land of death, and Russian industrials, even before the revolution, confirmed with such words: to visit Vaygach means to know death. Among the prisoners on the island, mortality was high, but by the standards of the Gulag, it was within the norm. But there were not only harsh climatic conditions, but also inhuman working conditions. The working day in the mines was in 3 shifts. For 6 hours, it was necessary to work with crowbars, picks, and jackhammers almost without rest. Prisoners, of course, died from illness and overwork. It was hardest in the winter when the temperature outside reached minus 40 Celsius, minus 45 Celsius. During strong winds and snowstorms, it was possible to move only by stretched ropes tied to the buildings. Staying on the island of Vaygach had also its privilege, so to say. Since it was impossible to escape from the island, the prisoners could move around without restriction. A year of work at the mines was counted as 2 years on account of the time received. Despite the difficult working condition, the food on the island was surprisingly good, so the slaves could sustain themselves. Compared to other Gulag prisoners, those who worked on the island of Vaygach looked better and healthier. However, this did not save from freezing, death from overwork, suicide, and murder due to showdowns within the camps. In addition to political prisoners, there were also ordinary convicts, murderers, thieves, and others. Although the working condition and harsh climatic conditions were difficult, the Vaygach expedition from 1930 gave the country good reserves of polymetallic ores, in particular lead, copper, and zinc. In 1934, the Vaygach plant was transferred to Glav Seyf-Morput, or Agency for the Main Northern Route. However, the new leadership also hired, so to say, Gulag prisoners to work. Then one such employee could receive 7 to 13 rubles a day. Perhaps the prisoners would have continued to work like this if it not had been for certain events. Firstly, although Vaygach ores were still necessary for the development of the country's industry, they became less interesting than fluorspar or fluorite. This mineral was discovered in 1932 near the island. Given its unique qualities and beauty, fluorite was equated with gold. Therefore, the mineral was valuable in the production of jewelry. Secondly, over time, most of the mine shafts began to be flooded more and more with seawater, which ascended from under the bay. The expedition leadership had no choice. Therefore, they slowly began to transfer mining equipment. And in 1938, when the mines were finally flooded, the mines were closed. All the prisoners working there were transferred to the mainland. They crossed the ice of the Yugorsky area on foot. From there, they were transferred to Vorkuta and further to detention camps and to other jobs. They were gone. Nowadays, those rare tourists and historians who managed to get to the island can see the remains of mines and barracks of that time. Vaygach is a large island in the alignment of the Ural Ridge between the Barents and Kara Seas, like I said, the closest to the mainland among the islands and archipelagos of the Russian Arctic. There are few people on the island, but many animals. But Vaygach is overflowing with history. For the Nenets and their predecessors, it is like Olympus and Mecca in one entity. And for the Pomors, and I'll explain to them, it is a meeting point of paths along the edge of the earth. And for the Soviet government, it is a failed industrial area that was developed by the KGB. Pomors, or Pomory, it's an ethnographic group descended from the Russian settlers, primarily from the Veliki Novgorod city, living on the White Sea coast and the territory whose southern border lies on the watershed which separates the White Sea River basin from the basins of rivers that flow south. They're very tough, very interesting people. But there are some other hypotheses about the creation of the island's name I want to let you know about. According to one, the name Vaygach goes back to the Nenets Vaygach, land of perdition. Others see the Russian root from the word Vayat, sculpt. That is a sculptured island. It means either alluvial or with sculpture. Finally, there is the semi-mythical Pomor Ivan Vaygach, from the Karelian word for silent, allegedly the first Russian to settle on the island in the 14th century. Another name for Vaygach is Habdia, that is Hebidyaya, the Holy Land. Although it is far from all the ancestral homes of mankind and people settled there in the Stone Age, the oldest of several sites is Litosal in the Dolgaya Bay. It became sacred no later than the 10th century, and the first to pray there were not even the Nenets, but the Sirtia, one of the how to pronounce the name, a semi-mythical people known to Russians as the Pechora, and most likely related to Saami people. I told you about this strange mythical tribe in my other videos. The Pechora traded with the Novgorod, the city of Novgorod. The oldest offerings of Vaygach shrines were made in ancient Russia. In the 12th century, Sirtia or Sihirta was assimilated by the future Nenets, who, however, assimilated their culture, and Vaygach as a sacred island passed to the new owners of the tundra by inheritance. According to legends, there lived Vesako and Hadako, the world's old man and old woman, and their sons, the god of the upper world Num, and his wife, the mother of other gods, Yamuni, and the god of the lower world Nga, and his wife Yamini. In not very reliable sources, they write that the Nenets had a special caste Chachsei, heart of God, the guards of the sanctuaries who lived on Vaygach watches. The sanctuary of Numa and Ga was the Balwansky mountain in the interior of the island, and the sanctuaries of Vesako and Hadako were the southern and northern capes, respectively, which in the past had the same name, Balwansky Nose. The southern Balwansky Nose is now called Cape Dyakonov and crowns a small peninsula of Hoseito, jutting into the Yugorsky Yar. Here, in the place of Vaygach, closest to the mainland, the main sanctuary was from the time immemorial, where there are still traces of sacrifices in our time, and until the 19th century there were many hundreds of idols. If Vaygach itself is the house of God, then Hoseito is the threshold. There are 12.5 shrines on Vaygach with sonorous names like Fox Stone, Deer Stone, Bear Stone, Balwansky Mountain, or Sitya Saleh, mainly in the mountains from the Barents Sea. For hundreds of years, visitors to this Arctic outpost have been frightened by terrifying totems and human sacrifices. Bolshoi Tsinkovy is the largest of 111 small islands surrounding Vaygach. Today, there is the oldest idol of the native Nenets people, perhaps dating to the 18th century, the successor of many earlier eerie effigies, mostly on Vaygach Island, to which Bolshoi Tsinkovy is a satellite. With 7 faces, it stands 1.28 meters in height, and women are forbidden to approach it. One face represents Vesako, seen as a patron of hunters, and the others are his demons. There is a 7-faced idol of the 18th century on Bolshoi Tsinkovy, and its 7-faced and sharp-headed side figures are erected to the Sihirta, and the composition is to the Pomor crosses. Pay attention to the offerings in front of this idol, like a deer figurine. Nenets sanctuaries are arranged very interestingly. As a rule, this is the simplest idol, maybe even a vertical stake or a stack of stones, but inscribed in the landscape as in a huge and majestic temple. The same 7-faced one sits on a rock throne crowning a cape with cliffs in the form of several human faces. But in the tundra, there is a small sanctuary of hair stone with a stone idol, and this whole figure of a man in Malitsa, so to say, except for the head. It was created by nature. The Nenets do not like to talk about holy places and do not approve of trips to them out of curiosity. They don't approve at all. In fact, many on the island are dual believers. They consider themselves Eastern Orthodox Christians. By the way, at one time, Baptists preached on the island, but they left with nothing. But the Nenets also treat spirits like weather or animals that is just given, just a given that needs to be reckoned with. And they know the spirits can enchant, twist, lure where it is not necessary to be lured to. And even some modern Russian travelers could hear the staccato barking of a dog in the fog, where there was nothing for people and a dog to do. So they hear something that is not there, but they hear it. There are no fantastic halmas on the island like the Nenets of Yamal, but a sled or a hood of the Buran vehicle may lie on the grave under the cross. Halmers, what is it? Nenets is buried in a huge box on stilts. divided into two halves. The deceased himself is sitting in the back. His things are in the front, which he takes with him to the next world. Men's graves are marked with a high stick. This is a gorey, a pole for chasing deer, which has been the main occupation of men for centuries. In some coffins, cracks have formed behind which the bones turn white. Local history records that the island I mentioned, the idol on that island originally stood on the Vaygach island. In Stalin times, a bulldozer crushed the idol, and soon afterwards, the vehicle driver died. That's how it's rumored on the island. In 1997, the idol was taken by historian Dr. Pyotr Boyarsky to St. Petersburg for the restoration. The scientist suffered ill health, and his museum suffered ill fortune, according to accounts. The idol came back in 2002, but Ninets people were unhappy with the repair and carried out their own work on it. A reindeer is often sacrificed to the island. Yet it is long ago that outsider ventured to Vaygach. Its name, again, means terrible death to some, or territory of death in the local language. And they felt the wrath of the idols on the island. For example, English navigator Stephen Barrow visited the island in 1556, searching for the northern passage to India. Barrow described how Russians showed him a heap of Samoyeds islands, how they called the people at the time, indigenous people, a site he described as the worst and the most unartificial work that ever I saw. I'll read from the Old English. He recorded how eyes and mouths of sundry of them were bloody. They had the shape of men, women, and children, very grossly wrought, and that with they had made for other parts were also sprinkled with blood. In front of some of the islands of the idols stood stacks of blocks as height as their mouths, which being all bloody were surmised by Barrow to be the table whereon they offered their sacrifice. Half a century later, a Dutch expedition seeking a way to China and India discovered 400 islands. They discovered 400 idols on what became known as the Cape of Idols on Vaygach. Travelers also recorded local warriors there, guarding the idols. In 1827, Eastern Christian Orthodox missionary, the Arkhangelsk Archimandrite Veniamin, described the sacred place before destroying it. On the island of Vaygach, since ancient times, two idols were worshipped, one named Vesako on the south end of the island, the other on the north is Hadako. Vesako was wooden, trihedral, thin, and very old, 2 arshins high, that's 1.4 meters. Greatness was attached to this idol by 420 wooden idols standing several rows in half circle. Of these, 20 were higher than others and had a height of 1.5 arshins, again about 1 meter. Near them, 30 skulls of polar bears lay on the ground. On the reindeer antlers were hangings 22 small axes, which were so rusty that many of the necks completely fell off the blade, and a few years from the copper kettles, buttons, iron nails, and multicolored scraps. Some 100 meters away were 20 stone idols. Veniamin destroyed the sacred place and ordered to burn the idols, but the Nenets people managed to keep many of them and made new ones. They made sacrifices, sometimes reportedly even human ones. The killings were carried out secretly, as those doing the killing could be handed to the Russian authorities by other Nenets. In 1895, artist Alexander Borisov visited Vaygach and recounted that he often spoke with the Samoyeds, telling them it is not good to bring human heads to Siadai, the common name for all Nenets' evil gods after they turned to Christianity, that it is immoral and contrary to the dictates of God. But they answered Borisov, yes, and that's why we do what is against God. We do this not for God, Haya, but for Saide, evil spirit, or devil, as they described it. And the devil likes what the Nenets do evil, and for this they will get many, many animals and fish. Borisov persuaded the Nenets to take him to the mountains and show idols hidden there. They did not agree for a long time, but finally gave in. Here, in that place, he found so many idols that were he to remove them, he would have needed 30 or 40 carts. There were piles of bounty found by the locals, axes, knives, chains, fragments of anchors, obviously taken from the ships, harpoons, wreckage from rifles and locks, bullets. And there Samoyed drove for thousands of miles to sacrifice a deer at the foot of the dwelling of the Lord of the polar deserts. Many people think that Samoyeds do not do this now, Borisov wrote, but they are cruelly mistaken. By the way, that idol that I described, to me it looks very much like the Shigir Island found this in Siberia, and you can see my videos about it. I find similarities, although the Siberian island is almost 12,000 plus years old, and I talked about it in other videos and elsewhere. Exploring the Vaygach Island in the year 2000, scientists from the Marine Arctic Complex expedition found several sacred places. Again, for example, the sanctuary of the Idols Mountain is located on one of the most visible peaks on a rocky ridge located in the interior of the island, in the basin of the Yunoyaha River. Some 5 kilometers across the tundra are stone idols built of flat stones, the highest about 2.5 meters, sided with fragments of horns, bones, and skulls. Dr. Boyarsky wrote down that Vaygach is the only sacred island on earth where no one lived since ancient times, yet for many centuries there were located the main sanctuaries of the peoples of the north. Therefore, Vaygach, for the history of mankind, is no less important than the famous Easter Island. Apparently, Vaygach's position played a certain role there. It is surrounded on all sides by sea, removed from the mainland and separated by the natural barrier, the Yugorsky Strait. From this point of view, Vaygach is a kind of natural fortress, inaccessible, according to Nenets, to the outside people, to the people who are not Nenets. Archaeologists claim that in the period of from 1 to 2nd centuries AD on the island of Vaygach, there were several settlements of tribes that are the ancestors of the Nenets. This fact was confirmed by the excavations of the sacrificial site carried out on Cape Bolvansky Nose, where objects of worship of the tribes that inhabited the island at that time were discovered. Well, around the 10th century, like I said, Novgorod merchants visited the mainland coast of the Pechora Sea and saw the island through the narrow strait of Yugorsky. which is mentioned in the chronicles of that period. In the summer of 1553, the expedition of the English king under Hugh Willoughby discovered the island of Vaygach together with the islands of the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, which is the fact of the discovery of the island by West Europeans. However, Hugh Willoughby did not consider Vaygach an island. He thought that Vaygach, like Novaya Zemlya, was one large peninsula prominent in the Arctic Ocean. This is how the cartographers of that time later depicted the Novaya Zemlya and Vaygach. Russian explorers began to explore the island only at the beginning of the 19th century, and even then only for the purpose of harvesting furs. Anyway, the discoverers of the British Vaygach, Stephen Barrow and Richard Johnson from the ship Search Shrift that arrived there in 1554 were met by a Pomor nicknamed a Mule, and in their travel notes, fierce natives with bows who drove them away from the sanctuaries, and Russian hunters who hunted bears are mentioned, from which it follows that they got along with each other, the Russians and the locals. Here is the Cape Karpova Stanovie south of the Bay of Lyamchina. For several centuries, the center of the Pomor crafts of Vaygach. Until the end of the 19th century, the polar islands were uninhabited. Russia's presence on them remained seasonally nominal, and the Norwegians increasingly competed with the Pomors. Everything went to the fact that the islands would go to those who would be the first to populate them. Locals say that it was all under Mother Catherine, meaning Russian Empress Catherine the Great. But in fact, Nenets Foma Wilka became the first inhabitant of Novaya Zemlya in 1869. For several generations, a special community has formed there, not shamanist/reindeer herders, but double faith believers, traders. And therefore, not from the south, but from the north, the Nenets began to move to Vaygach in the 20th century. Contact with the Lutsi, or Russians, in the trading posts where guns were exchanged for furs very soon after this event radically impacted the entire way of life of the Vaygach and Yamal Nenets and led to the overthrow of their gods. In 1826-1828, missionaries toured all the sanctuaries available to them and destroyed them. Wooden images of the patrons of the Nenets clans standing in the middle part of Vaygach, on the sacred mountain and on the cape of the end of the earth, Yamal Saleh, were burned. At the southern tip of the island, they were dumped into the Yugorsky Shar Strait. Crosses appeared instead of them, but the Nenets continued to go to their sanctuaries. It seemed to the missionaries that they were praying to Christ, bowing down to the cross, but in reality they were praying to the survivor Sidiya, buried in the ground. In 1912-14, even one of the weather stations in the whole of the Imperial Russia was built at the Karagate, which moved to the Bolvansky Nose in the 1950s and recently burned, from what I heard. However, the old Vaygach, its ruins in the spirit of modernity, almost the northernmost stone pre-revolutionary buildings, are still standing. At that time, 10 to 15 people lived on the island, mostly fishermen, but everything changed under the Soviets. In 1927, a trading post appeared in the Dolgaya Bay, and a reindeer husbandry farm started operating in the tundra of the island. The population of Vaygach jumped to hundreds of people at once and remains at this level to this day. Lighthouses replaced the landmark crosses, here and there mainly in the form of logs. The OGPU KGB expedition founded, buildings made of logs. The KGB expedition founded Varnek, named after the bay, named after Alexander Varnek, who explored Vaygach in 1898 on the steamship Paktusov. In 4 years, Vaygach has grown into a large village, acquiring even such an attribute as a museum, but then everything moved to the island. And that first Vaygach is actually Anderma today. But there is also the house of the head of the expedition, a huge old barn and a tractor on an earthen pedestal. Now Vaygach is a very cozy village of 20 houses. 6 of them are not for housing. A common yard for hundreds of ninets. And there is a shop with a frighteningly miserly assortment of goods. A bakery with delicious crusty bread, described by modern people who were able to get to the island. And a brand new bathhouse, very important feature. There is no cellular connection there, but there is a very costly internet. There is the headman, Vladimir, who came to the island from Shoina, and Misha, who is both a dispatcher, a baker, and an electrician. The reindeer herder, Stanislav, and many others. When there are so few people, everyone inevitably becomes a standout individual. In the summertime, young people and relatives, including Russians who married Nenets and who left the island for the city, they visit, and depending on the season, there are from 80 to 120 people on the island. The main surnames are Vilko. It would be more correct to be Vilka, but apparently the passport officer was from Ukraine, so the last name ends with letter O. Valeyski, it would be more correct to be Valey, and Taibarei. Almost all are descendants of settlers from Novaya Zemlya, or even personally, there are Tikovilki. And although they all know that there is now a nuclear test site on Novaya Zemlya, many of their ancestors moved to Vaygach under their own means back in the 1930s. Most of the families have many children, but there is no school in Vaygach. Instead, there is a boarding school in Karataika, in the responsibility of the village council, of which Vaygach is located, and young people tend to leave and go to settle on the mainland. In addition to the village, there are many fishing huts on the island, which serve as more of a stronghold for hunting and reindeer husbandry. Only 2 people live permanently in the huts. The Andrei mentioned before in the Bay of Lemchina and Vasily in the Deravataya. There is no electricity in the huts. Kerosene lamps are waiting for dark nights. Deer skins lie on beds and bunks, and goose wings serve as brooms. Sometimes the huts are damaged by drunk people, careless tourists, or animals. For example, an oven was torn apart by a polar bear because someone forgot something edible in it. And it seems that the islanders should go to the sea, but no, all life on Vaygach is centered inside the island. Here they live by hunting in the tundra, and even dogs know that you cannot ruin nests. And they do fishing in lakes, and in the sea they only put nets near the shore, checking them with oars. But into the ocean, as they say on the island, they don't row. There are currents that will take them at best to the island of Dolgi or even to the next world, if they're not careful. However, Vaygach is not a mainland tundra. There are many steep banks, high cliffs. Deer and dogs will stop before danger, but there is no hope for technology there. In winter, when there is practically no daylight, an unwary carrier can gape and fall off a high cliff into the abyss. There are many such cases. Mostly young men are dying. Rumor has it that the island is taking revenge for breaking ancient taboos, and the population, which in fact has recently taken shape there, has its own myth-making. For example, they say that before traveling on the tundra, sometimes in the middle of a winter blizzard, and they're quite scary there on that treeless island, those blizzards. A girl in summer clothing appears. It's like a harbinger of imminent death. People need to stop, talk to the ghost, smoke, finally just change shoes. Perhaps this is such a life-saving strategy because hallucinations appear in very tired people. A little rest will allow a person to gather their strength and return home. There is a taboo on visited, protected places. Any visitor will be told a terrible story that happens to those who violated the ban. Nobody knows how reliable the stories are, but that's what they're being told. And any visitor must be taken to the local accessible attractions, to the cape located about 7 kilometers from the village, where the remains of mines have been preserved, and to the more distant Cape Diakov, where one of the sanctuaries and the famous rift is located, a hole in a horizontal rock under which sea waves are raging at a decent distance. A visit to the sanctuary is also complemented by a trip, as well as a recommendation to sacrifice something to the spirits, a candy or preferably a cigarette. In general, cigarettes and even fresh fruits and vegetables are the most valuable goods on the island. The local cooperative delivers food quite rarely during the northern delivery time, and perishable products are there only for a very short time on the island. Delivery by air, by helicopter, makes goods unthinkably expensive. There was a conflict with the local population, which was outraged by the high costs of cigarettes. For this reason, the cooperative stopped importing them. They are brought from the mainland, from where a passenger helicopter arrives twice a month. But the population itself asks not to bring alcoholic beverages to the store. The residents, led by their small leadership, organized themselves and made such a decision. Of course, it gets smuggled anyway. The main Vaygach transportation means is an old patch snowmobile Buran. Yamaha and Polar Cats are not listed there. Firstly, with one caterpillar and a pair of skis on the summer tundra, it will not pass. And secondly, yes, they will not break themselves, but if you plant one in a swamp, land in a swamp, or break it on the rocks, it will remain there, and you will just throw it away. But with the Buran, you can repair it with a crowbar. There are no ATVs on the island, and the only one Karakat appeared there recently. The main problem of transportation on Vaygach is the shortage of gasoline, which is delivered there in a limited batch by air delivery, and on order. It cost 100,000 rubles per barrel. It's like 500 rubles per liter, but those were 2018 prices, so you can imagine how expensive it is today. Well, there is Sergei in Varnek, who has plenty of gasoline since he travels to Amderma on business and buys it there. And Andrei from Lyamchina rides dogs and laughs at everyone who laughed at him when they start running out of fuel, so they can laugh at him riding the dogs. But you have no gas, you get stuck. And by the way, I should mention the Guri. Those are stone pyramids on the island, and they're not sanctuaries, but landmarks. The helicopter flies to the island once every 2 weeks, but the locals are happy with this. Until 2009, it flew only once a month, and in addition, it was not equipped with modern navigation, so there was simply no village in the rain of fog, so to say, and to land to. And teasing the islands with buzzing noise, it flew back, burning the monthly quota of gasoline in vain. Now it's very easy to fly to Vaygach, but it's much more difficult to get to Vaygach. The helicopter carries half a ton of government cargo, whatever it may be, and some that was ordered by the local people. There is no full-fledged berth in Varnek, and sometimes tugs entering the bay are just an accidental occurrence. There's another problem with those tugs. Their crews sometimes carry a couple of hundredweight of alcohol, hiding them for sale. When the tugs approach the island, they didn't, those who guide them don't take their eyes off the sailors. They say that if alcohol gets there, hell begins, and the most beautiful people suddenly grow horns and hooves. For the Nenets, firewater is an evil spirit that they hate, but they cannot resist it. There's a very eloquent legend about the whole village that became extinct from the fact that sea brought to ashore a barrel of methyl alcohol, and they all got drunk and died as a result. But as Russian travelers stated, all the bad things about the islanders are only from hearsay, and according to their personal impressions, the Vaygach Nenets are one of the most worthy people in the world, and their life seems hard, like war. Everyone will tell you who of his friends drowned, who froze, who died, who got drunk and died, and in the sea or tundra they die again being drunk. But the polar islanders have a special attitude to life. And so when Andrei Vilka was carried away by the current into the open sea, he simply said to himself, "Come what may," and lay down on the bottom of the boat to sleep. Since 1988, IKE has been working on Vaygach, an international Arctic complex expedition, and the main modern explorers of the island were Peter Boyarsky and Ilya Borishev. The islanders have an ambiguous attitude towards them, to put it mildly. For several years, they tried to organize a national park on the island, but the islanders did not give the go-ahead, fearing that they would be banned from hunting there. Now the authorities have a different concept: to limit visits to the most important monuments of nature and history, like the Bolshoi Tsinkovo or Hasaito, and the locals are generally happy with the idea. And they're used to tourists. Tourists come to the island, of course, but only a few times a year, including Naryan Mar yachtsmen and the Pechora and the Volga vessels. But every tourist manages to get acquainted with almost the entire population of the island, if they get there. Vaygach is actually a whole archipelago. It's surrounded by 111 small islands and rocks, but each of them is somehow noticeable. Heads, faces, figures are constantly seen in the rocks of Vaygach. Is that why the island was considered sacred? Well, we answered that question. Vaygach has beautiful rocky shores, with the exception of swamps at the mouth of the rivers. The most beautiful places, they say, are in the north, in the base of the Algaya and the Ravataya. And the latter is the best place to wait out storms. Far from the sea, Vaygach is completely different, although the heights of the island rarely exceed 100 meters. The highest point is 157 meters, Bolvanskaya mountain in the north. These are the real mountains, which some Russians call nothing else but the Vaygach Urals, or Urals. In the mountains, there are indescribably many, mostly nameless, purest lakes, over which snow fields melted in July, and beyond the mountains begins swampy tundra. Before the trip, people were sure that the entire eastern part of the island is flat and swampy, but in fact, mountains and rocks begin again closer to the Kara Sea, and in the middle of the Vaygach, it's more swampy. The swamps there are not continuous, and there are passable swamps, but it is impossible to cross Vaygach on foot without getting your feet wet. But with all the friendliness of the Vaygach nature, there is one creature that makes it deadly. It is polar bear, so you should not go near the sea without a gun and a dog. Bears are brought to the island in the spring on ice floes, and the locals divide them into two castes. Arctic bears see a person for the first time, and when they encountered humans, they just turn their heads, not really knowing what it is and what they eat it with. But the garbage bears, having learned to eat human scraps, huskings, like seeds get used to the fact that where people are, there is food, and the people themselves are quite edible. Bears rarely come to the south of the island. They live almost constantly in the north. And they say that somewhere there they have a maternity tract. They are the least dangerous in the heat when they do not run, but cling to the snowfields. And they're the most dangerous at night, preferring not to chase people, but to nail them sleeping in tents. Visitors saw old tracks on the Kara coasts of the bears. Locals tell the newcomers that using flares when seeing a bear, well, the flares should not be fired into its face. The bears just won't notice it, but to the side so that it chases them. Traumatic bullets are like a mosquito bite to the bear, but bears are really already afraid of pellets. They learn to be with humans. The main enemy of the polar bear is dogs, who take an advantage of the superiority in maneuverability, simply twist it, and they can pinch bear's heels, and the bear, accustomed to impunity and invincibility, simply does not know how to treat it. However, the most terrible animal of the Vaygach is this. The local mosquitoes are afraid only of the Tyumeny, Siberian DETA method, because some environmentally friendly bourgeois mosquito repellent helps for 10 minutes and is despised by rugged Russian mosquitoes. And those mosquitoes bite through the 3 layers of clothing. One of the main words of the trip is Kamaria, which is squadron of mosquitoes. Of the animals, deer are the brightest. There are about 1,000 of them on the island, and it's hard to say whether they are farm animals there or wild. Once there was a state farm there, but in the 1990s, according to the custom of the time, it was destroyed. But a relatively small herd of about 1,800 heads remain on the island. They cannot go beyond the sea. There are no predators dangerous for them on the island, so the reindeer herders of Vaygach do not follow the herds. They just periodically sit down on the buran vehicle, catch up with the deer, and saw off their horns. It is easy to find deer. They always go against the wind. As the wind blows away the gadflies from them, striving to lay their larvae under the skin. The whole tundra is covered in their tracks and discarded horns, and a local once observed a pair of skulls in the tundra, tightly locked horns. But if you twist your leg or get bogged down in a swamp, write yourself off from this planet. Here, at that island, no one will help, simply because there is no one to do so for miles and miles. But there are no dangerous predators far from the sea. Neither a wolf nor a brown bear will be found in the Vaygach tundra. There is drinking water in every lake, and by August there is tons of cloudberries on every hammock. And because of that, on a dry and sunny, windy day, there is something of a paradise there. And main islanders are the geese. There, in the frame of a gray hummingbird and a black and white brown-tailed geese, there is also a white-browed goose and a piskulka, or squeak, that justifies its name. There are many canyons on the mainland, separated from Vaygach by narrow strait of the Yugra Peninsula. This is how the Urals meets the sea. There are a lot of rivers with and without canyons on Vaygach, and some can be crossed by walking on rocks or pebbles, and some by wading. Vaygach Island is a border zone, and entry to its territory is possible only with a special permit from the Russian government. This regime was especially strengthened after the organization of the nuclear test site on the islands of the Novaya Zemlya archipelago. Currently, the island is visited quite rarely, especially after the closure of the meteorological station at Cape Bolvansky Nose. The development of tourism in these places is absolutely hopeless in view of severity of climatic conditions and remoteness of the island from the developed infrastructure. I heard of very strange UFOs sighted over Vaygach about 15 years ago. Maybe they were there to spy on the Novaya Zemlya or to shepherd the ecological damage that humans inflict on this planet. The desolate islands were used in the Soviet times as major atomic test base, and 62 years ago, it was the site of the 1961 Tsar Bomba test, the most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated. They were also used as a site for storing atomic waste. Radioactive material from naval and atomic icebreakers was sunk there in containers. The islands between the Barents and Kara Sea lie along the Northern Sea route, which due to global warming is providing a new and growing route for shipping between Europe and Asia, and will change the world economy. You will see. Novaya Zemlya test site was designed in 1954 and was in use for much of the Cold War. It is reported that 224 nuclear detonations were undertaken on Novaya Zemlya, with a total explosive energy equivalent to 265 megatons of the TNT. But it was not only the USSR that damaged the ecology of the planet, and UFOs have been visiting such sites, as have UFOs, the unidentified submersible objects. But I believe there is more to the island of Vaygach than just secrecy about past nuclear testing. So I appreciate your attention to my research. Please support me by doing it through the links you will see in the description to this video. I'll tell you more interesting stories about strange, inaccessible, and fascinating places in Eurasia. Please like my videos and please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for your support and attention to my work.